All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today, we are lucky to have Gerald Rochelle. Gerald is a prominent figure in the practical philosophy movement that we have been exploring at the Stoa recently. And he wrote a book called Doing Philosophy, which has a pretty self-explanatory title. And it's something that we've obviously been trying to figure out how to do here at the Stoa. So I'm very grateful for Gerald to be here. And I'm going to take him in a moment. He'll further introduce himself, and he will share his screen, and we'll have a presentation on how we can do philosophy. And after which we'll have a pivot to a Q&A. So if you have any questions anytime, put in the chat. I'll call on you. You're going to mute yourself and ask your question. And then we'll close hopefully with a group activity. We're here 60 minutes in total. So that being said, welcome to the Stoa, Gerald. And you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm unmuted. And thank you very much, Peter, for that nice introduction. I think that was Joanna Newsom, the music, wasn't it?
It's the Innocent Mission Green Bus.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, a little bit about myself, perhaps before I start. Not too much, I assure you. I'm speaking from England, where I live, close to the Welsh border. Very nice place. It's actually just going dark at the moment. Now, my main philosophical work over the years has been to do with time, more particularly the unreality of time. I've spent many years working on that, involved with the thoughts of a philosopher called MacTaggart, one of the last great British idealists who died in 1925. And this metaphysical quest put me in touch with the idea of love as a non-temporal quality. Fascinating, though often quite mind-boggling. Then I became involved in philosophical counselling. I wanted to do something practical. And from that, which I found a little bit unsatisfactory, I moved into something more practical philosophy. I was editor of the journal called Practical Philosophy for some years, and I enjoyed that very much, looking at the work of other people, reading it, listening to other people, and so on. This involvement with philosophical practice still caught me up with my ideas about time and love. And it led me to the idea of philosophy with strangers. It seemed quite a new departure, and because it was fairly novel to me, it interested me particularly. And that practice of practical philosophy with strangers allowed me to experience a number of moments with people that combined my practical and metaphysical interests amazingly. For me, it really worked. People, time, love, reality. Extraordinary. And it led me to a phrase that I use a lot in what I write these days, beyond within. It allowed me to feel beyond and yet within the context or the person of another. So I believe that you do not need to be a so-called philosopher to do philosophy. Anyone can do philosophy when they have the freedom, space to reflect in a meaningful way. Sometimes it's useful if there's someone there to help, a stranger. For me, philosophizing can find expression in so many ways. It's exciting, it's rewarding. It can help us to a better life. What a better reason could we possibly have? So that's enough about me and how I find myself here, if that's okay. I think now I have to press screen share, which I'll do. And then I select what's going to be a sort of presentation of words. And I hope that's okay with you. It won't go on too long. I'm now sharing that. And I press play on this Mac. Okay. Now I can't move that in a way that's, it's all right. I've got all your pictures up and I'm just trying to figure out a way of moving it so it doesn't obscure anything. We'll see. You've come to the top. That's great. Okay, doing philosophy. It can involve us in many things. Look at the range. It's extraordinary. Philosophy can take us to so many places. I've got time in there. I've got life, death, and immortality, something that interests me particularly. And cosmology, which interests me a great deal. But the range is enormous. We know we can go almost anywhere with philosophy. So, why do we do it? A little bit, no, I'm moving the wrong thing. That's it. Okay. I'm going to be moving that block of your pictures around quite a bit, I think. Okay, why do it? Well, there's no right answers, but there are many conclusions that can be drawn by a careful reflection. Many of these can be, as I've mentioned already, some of the words, satisfying, because of how we've arrived at them. We find that we've used a path to actually get there. Exciting, of course, because what we come to know from doing it. And influential, because these things can stick with us and they can affect our future thinking and our lives and the way that we live with others, most importantly. In other words, I think doing philosophy is good for us. I pressed the wrong thing. That's it. Now I'm going to have to move that down there. Okay, doing philosophy could be good for us, yes. As we all know, our lives are very complex and our individual circumstances always differ from others. Even if we live with someone, even if we're very close with someone, we still have differences with other people. And doing philosophy can help us understand better the world that we live in as individuals. I believe it can help us lead a more useful and fulfilling life because of that. And it can help us move towards something that, as we know, Socrates called the good life. Socrates is a favorite character of mine. I actually write fictional work about Socrates. He interests me a great deal. And doing philosophy can help us, make us perhaps a little wiser and help us flourish. Beautiful word. It can point us to what Aristotle thought the object of life, living and doing well, flourishing. That's when we feel satisfied with our lives, when we feel as though we're living well, doing well, flourishing. So, how can we approach doing philosophy? Well, conventionally, we can approach it by looking at the history of it. All philosophy students always have to look at the history of philosophy and what philosophers have said in the past and written in the past and so on. Or we can study it by topic. We can go into science, philosophy of mind, cosmology, time, and so on. And both of these have their merits, of course. But whichever we choose, it remains important to have an understanding of what philosophers have already thought about, yes. But without this, we would waste too much time trying to think over the same ground. But I've read about philosophy, what others have said. I've written about philosophy, and I've thought about philosophy. But there's a big but. It's not in itself an historical, topic-based process. Philosophy is to do with us. It's to do with using our imagination, how we can come up with new ideas, and importantly, how we can argue for them, how we can defend them. That's not necessarily to somebody else, although it often will be, but also to ourselves. Philosophy is to do with challenging existing ideas by providing rational arguments against them. Philosophy is an activity. It's something we do. We don't sit behind a desk staring at a wall doing philosophy, I don't think. We have to be active and actively involved in it. The best and most meaningful way of being involved in philosophy, for me, is that activity. It's doing it in a practical way. It's a practical thing. Use our imagination, use our ideas, argue for them. For me, doing philosophy is practical, and practical philosophy helps me to any of these things. Understand more about the nature of the world, understand more about the relationships that I have with the world. Feel at ease sometimes. We all get anxious about things. Feel at ease about being in the world. Know what it is to be true, to act truly, and to have a concept of meaning. Very importantly, to be free, to act freely, on the basis of what I understand to be the meaning of things. And then, very crucially, particularly as we become older, I think, not to fear death. And always not to fear life. For me, again, I'm repeating, practical philosophy is a practical approach, doing philosophy is a practical approach to finding out and coming to know within ourselves, somehow coming to know. So, importantly, doing philosophy uses reason. We need to argue effectively, as I've said, either to someone else or to ourselves. And to do that, we need to be aware of what it is to reason. There is little or nothing to be gained by proclaiming we have a philosophy about this or that without supporting our ideas for reason. That is the weakest use of the word. Or to say, we have no declared reasons for holding a view, simply to state, that's what I believe and that's all there is to it. This would just be an expression of faith. That's not doing philosophy. So, we must learn to express our ideas in a reasoned way and develop an ability to modify or strengthen our own case as we proceed. We need to put over our ideas in a convincing way. And I stress again, that's not only to others, but it's to ourselves. There's no room for self-deceit in doing philosophy. There is every bit of space for what Sartre called mauvaise foi, good faith. Okay, so then how can we actually do it? Well, we can talk to people. Let's concentrate on that because this particularly interests me. Any people, those we know, but strangers as well, especially strangers. Why? Because we don't know anything about them. We have no shared background, no shared history. We don't know what they think about things. This is an amazing opportunity to do philosophy with someone that you don't know. We do practical philosophy in this way and talk to others. We should ask them their views and try to explain ours, maybe. We should always allow others to express their ideas. We need to listen. We should take up their ideas by developing them in a helpful way. Maybe if we get to know more, we can reject them. But with strangers, there's one word there that is the watchword, and that's listen. We approach someone we don't know. There are particular ways of doing that, and we listen to them. We ask them one thing and we listen to them. How many opportunities do we have for that in our lives? It's a terrific gift to allow someone to give us of themselves and to listen to them. It can be the most extraordinary, loving opportunity. We also need to allow for change in every question that's raised, any outcome from discussion with others, things that come into our own minds, etc., or from specific ideas. Anything that's introduced to us, we must be available to encourage the process of change. Doing philosophy doesn't mean fixed, doesn't mean that's what I think, I've reached that conclusion, that's the end of it. Not at all. I've been through the process, I've reached that conclusion, But hang on, I've just heard something that makes me think perhaps I can do this in a slightly different way. Remember, we should always test our thoughts and the thoughts of others against standard logical forms of argument. You will know all this well, but those two ways are very important to bear in mind. A deductive argument provides conclusive support for its conclusion, and it must be true as long as it's properly constructed and its premises are true. Nobody as yet has actually found an a priori premise which is actually true. So deductive arguments are always on slightly tricky grounds. But the process of a deductive argument, if we can use something that's pretty strong to begin with, is a very solid one. Or an inductive argument. An inductive argument provides only probable support for its conclusions, providing it supplies strong evidence. We live in very much an inductive argument-led world. Inductive argument is the process of science. And we're surrounded by scientific thinking and the conclusions that science comes up from the premises that it uses. But we have to be a little wary of many of those things. We only have to look back a little bit in history to see how many things have been overturned that have seemed very positive because of inductive argumentation. We must always ask of any argument, how is it justified? What makes it true? Why should we believe it? Somebody says to me, I think the earth is really flat. I've got to ask, but how do you justify that? And if you can think you can justify it, well, what makes that true? Why should we believe it? Why should I believe it? They're really very simple questions to ask, I know, but they provide a terrific foundation for dealing with the arguments of others and dealing with our own arguments. And we must also ask whether or not the argument has true reasons, a logical framework, and valid conclusions. Okay. And also whether or not the argument is properly formulated. This, I think, is extremely important. The contents of an argument might be, well, maybe true, maybe not so true, maybe strong, maybe not so strong. But we need always to challenge the formulation of an argument. If it isn't put together right, if it's disconnected, if things don't link, then really it's not an argument. It's something else, and we're in different territory. So the formulation of an argument is always very, very important. And we must always reflect on and question the elements of our thinking process. If we find them lacking, we must work out why and refine them. And remember, we need continually to do these things, challenge ourselves. Why have we decided on a certain view? What brought us there? How have we reached that view? Whether or not is it defensible? I told you very briefly at the beginning how I arrived at practical philosophy. Working on the unreality of time, you can't get much more detached from reality than that, because time seems to be the fundamental reality. So why did I decide that that would lead me to something more practical? How did I reach that view? How did I get there? And is it really defensible? We need to remind ourselves all the time, I think, of that type of system that lies behind how we think. But we must not be afraid to take on new ideas and concepts. Step outside our normal thinking habits. Well, what can I think? I've always thought that. I always cross the road before I see a traffic light or something. We must be aware of new things always. It doesn't matter how long we've been here. It doesn't matter how set we are in certain ways. We should always be available. And that's where the stranger can be extremely influential in the way that we think, because suddenly we're confronted by something we never before might have thought of. And I'm repeating because I'm I think it's necessary to repeat it. I think we need to remember the formulation of the argument. In a way, more than the ideas pursued or the conclusion we reach. Let's know whether the thing's put together properly. How is it justified? What makes it true? Why should it be believed? Have true reasons been used? Is there a logical framework? And only then have valid conclusions been reached. Now, my message is very simple. Do some practical philosophy. I'm thinking again of strangers. I would need to give you more information about how I tackle that, but it needn't be strangers. And I say, go out, approach someone, put what we've said here into practice, see what happens. It's exciting. It can bring challenge and novelty into our lives, and sometimes maybe even a little wisdom. And if that happens, then we've really got somewhere. So I repeat, give it a go. And I remind us of that range at the bottom. And one more click takes me to the point at which I can say, and of course, you can always challenge yourself by reading the book about doing philosophy. I know that's self-advertising, but there's a lot of stuff in there which challenges every single one of these headings. And it asks common sense questions about those and says, tackle this. See how you can work out what you think about them. And if you're interested particularly in work with strangers, then we may talk about that in our upcoming session of questions now. But there is stuff on my website, Doing Philosophy, about work with strangers. It's a fascinating process. At which point I stop and I say to Peter, what do I do now?
Awesome. Thank you for that, Gerald. I'll stop sharing your screen for a moment. We might share it again near the end. But if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat right now. I'll call on you. You can ask your question. I'll warm up Gerald with some questions of my own. My first question is immediately going to, the praxis of how to talk to strangers. We have lots of different kind of conversational techniques that we explored here at the Stoa. One of them that's coming up is street epistemology, and they have like a real method of going on the street and figuring out people's epistemic methodology. But doing philosophy is just broader than just one's epistemics. So I'm curious, how do you go about it personally, and how do you recommend going about it, talking to strangers, or even having important philosophical conversations with friends and family who might not be accustomed of getting into the philosophical weeds?
Okay, well, on strangers, the first thing is it's sort of dangerous because a lot of people aren't used to being approached in an unusual way, and you're always thinking, is this going to be okay? So the first thing is you're much better always to approach one person. If you approach a pair, you stand a good chance of getting ganged up against, and it's not going to work. And I would do something like this. I'm going to say something to someone that is unusual and unusually engaging. So let's say I'm standing in a queue, waiting for something. And there's a youngish woman standing there. I wouldn't usually approach a youngish woman at all. That's not a thing that you would do. So I might say to her, God, I really love your hair. It's gorgeous. Huh? Dangerous. She might turn around and walk away. She might also say, that's really kind of you. How nice. And I'd say, yes, terrific. She'd say, I had that done yesterday. I was really worried about getting it done. I wasn't sure about the color, but anyway, my mom said, and so on and so on. And you can end up a quarter of an hour later hearing about somebody's life, and you can become so close to them because of that it just can knock you over sometimes. I don't know whether that's a good example. It is a good example, yeah. That's how to do it. You go to it can be even worse than that. When I've done workshops on this, I've said to people, go out, give it a go. And some people have come back with awful stories. And some people have come back glazed-eyed and just filled with the magic of it. It's risky, but it's beautiful. And for me, it dovetails into this, the work I did on McTaggart and time. McTaggart, have you ever heard of him? No. He believed that the universe was essentially a love thing. It was love. And love was out there in a non-temporal, non-physical way. And occasionally we just get a little shard of it pokes in on us. And that's when we say, oh, I feel in love. Oh, I feel loving. We're just getting a little shard of the real stuff. And my experience with linking with strangers is that we can get that little shard of experience with somebody else because none of the normal barriers are there. We don't know them. We're not having a meal with them. We're not entertaining them. We're not doing anything at all like that. It's completely devoid of that stuff. And so it allows for the magic to come in.
And one thing that you said too is philosophy can be dangerous, and I totally agree with that. And all the different kind of topics and areas we can go is pretty much anywhere. It's one of the disciplines that afford that, I think. And in today's climate, when there's so much political topics that are heated and just sort of has a tendency to shut people's minds down. And those are often the topics that are most salient for most people, and the ones that they would want to maybe talk about. How do you get people into the right setting and conditions to philosophize about really dangerous and heated topics?
If people have got very strong political views or very strong socio-political views, I think it's very, very hard, if not impossible, because you just can't get around that. It's like it's a huge barrier in front of you. If it is possible, and if people don't hold extremely solid views like that, I would ask something very, very sort of unusual in a way. What do you think about, sex? What do you think about the way that we treat people when they've done some harm in the society? What do you think about, just something that goes beyond the normal sort of constructs of protection that a lot of people have. It's very hard, and that's why the stranger experience can be so much more fulfilling, strangely enough, because you don't deal with any of those things, and your approach goes underneath them. And I say, you might get the shard coming in. I was talking to somebody only the other day, and it became very clear that she was a solid socialist, just seething with it, and nothing else outside that mattered to her. And so it was sort of impossible to get around that, and very, very hard to talk to her. And I would just peel away.
So let's get some voices in, other voices. Maggie, you had a share in the chat. I don't know if that was a question or just something to share. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question or your share to Gerald?
Oh, no, sorry. That wasn't meant as a question, just to respond to your inquiry about how to engage with potentially conflicting topics with strangers. Sorry about that.
Is there anything you want to share on that thread?
Oh, just, I think you yourself practice this masterfully, engaging in good faith inquiry and really just, asking questions with true intent to understand and not seeking to before being understood. So I thought that popped up. I meant to share silently in the chat.
Thanks, Maggie, and sorry for putting you on the spot. But to double click on that, kind of how can the Socratic method be weaponized in a sense? And then how do you determine what are the ingredients for good faith that you see, Gerald? Like, so sometimes the line is pretty fine. Like, okay, they're asking questions. It seems inviting enough, but then there's something there that you can kind of sense that it's a bad faith inquiry. So how do you suss that out?
Well, I think you need to test yourself all the time. Am I acting in good faith? Am I using some ulterior motive? Have I got something in the background that's driving me to do this? Sometimes the answers are not going to be the ones we want to hear. But the test of good faith is a very difficult one. But I think I still feel very sensitive to this idea of stepping round the sort of protections that we've got. But would you have heard of Jeremy Corbyn? He was the leader of the Labour Party in this country. I'm a great friend of his brother, Piers. I knew him when I was at school. And he's a very funny character, a very tough socialist. He calls everybody comrade, calls me comrade. And we were together not long ago, sitting in a pub, and we were just the two of us. We had other people with us, and everybody went, and they left us together. And we sat and we just looked at each other for a second, and he leant forward. Actually, he calls me Rocky because that's what he called me at school. He leant forward and he said, "Rocky, what do you think about the female orgasm?" And that was, to me, that was an extraordinary offer of going around everything. There's nothing to do with politics, nothing to do. It was something that we can all perhaps have an opinion on, even though it might not be an educated one. But it stepped around everything. And I always remember that as a wonderful way of using this, keeping out of the known territory, as it were.
All right. Evan McMullen, you had a question.
Yeah, so thank you, Peter and Gerald. I want to preface the question I wrote in the chat by saying I actually do pretty much take up Taggart's arguments about the unreality of time. So you're not going to need to sell me on that one. You'll see why when I ask you the question I said that. So around these parts of the internet, you hear the refrain that we have many philosophy professors and few philosophers. I've also noticed that many of the thought leaders in this corner of the noosphere that are trying to catalyze some sort of systemic change in society seem to me to suffer from a common malady, which I call ignorance of material history. So I'd like to tie these two observations into a question for you, which is, to what extent do you believe that philosophy needs to be informed by a grounding in material history, both in its broad strokes as well as the personally relevant past?
Yeah. That's very difficult. I think we need to know something of the past, yes, as I said. How much we need to take it into account, I'm not so sure. I think perhaps we reach a point of departure in our own lives, in our own activity of good faith. We should reach a point of departure. We say, okay, I've read enough, I've heard enough, I've written enough. Now, where am I? And can I depart a little from that? I don't know, is that an answer? I'm not sure.
No, I think it's actually a really lovely answer. My takeaway from that is that, yes, you need some grounding in this, but the point of life, as I'm hearing you say it, has something to do with, your own perspective on things, which of course is going to be independent of the some deterministic structure of material history. And I really like that answer. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So perhaps we can pivot to the exercise soon, as there's no questions in the chat. But maybe I'll ask you one more before we do that. Is your friend Rand Laval came to the Stoa recently, and he gave a good preview of the practical philosophy movement, which is kind of a niche, small movement in philosophy. It's something that influenced me, but it's something that hasn't really interacted with many other kind of intellectual spaces that we look at here at the Stoa. I'm trying to change that. And he talked about philosophical counseling and he had a critique on philosophical counseling, saying you can't really instrumentalize something along the lines of you can't really instrumentalize philosophy to a counseling setting. And I'm curious what you think of philosophical counseling and Rand's critique, and any other kind of thoughts that came alive with anything I said.
In the practical philosophy movement, if you can call it that, I rather burn my bridges with philosophical counseling when I announced and wrote about and broadcast, I don't think anybody should take any money for it. So that rather separated me from a large part of the philosophical counseling movement. I don't think it's an activity which should be an exchange of labor for reward. I think counseling, in as much as listening to and taking note of and giving appropriate feedback, that has a philosophical grounding up to the point that I said with Evan, when we declare that we know enough about, is very, very useful. But that so easily turns into a job for money, and I don't like that. Now I know Rand's situation, his deep philosophy, is rather different, but it certainly isn't individual. He would agree. I think it isn't an individual approach to individuals in the same way that I see practical philosophy. It's more a sort of search for a very particular way with a group of committed people.
Awesome. Evan, you might have another question you mentioned, and then we'll pivot to the breakout rooms.
Yeah, so feel free to not give an answer to this if you don't want to, but I'm curious, a lot of the stuff you're speaking of and, just the vibe of McTaggart, which you've mentioned a couple times as something of a colleague or an influence, makes me think of Peter Kingsley and his work on recovering the teachings of the Parmenides and Empedocles and the pre-Socratic tradition as not just philosophers in the modern sense, but mystics of a certain kind, encountering death more directly. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about Peter, his work, or just that whole idea of philosophy as sort of being descended from or inextricably linked to something like shamanism or mysticism.
I can't comment on his work. I don't know enough about it, I'm afraid. So the answer to that is no. The other part of the question, I said I like Socrates. My most influential philosopher, almost in a way, is I've forgotten his name. I can't have forgotten his name.
Epictetus?
No, not Epictetus. This is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. However, I have forgotten, so I'm not worried about it. He says, the biggest obstacle to living an appropriate and fulfilling life is anxiety. Get rid of anxiety, and you stand a good chance of reaching Epicurus. My wife has just put her head through the door and said, Epicurus, of course, Epicurus. The biggest obstacle to a fulfilled life is anxiety, fear of death, fear of God, fear of pain. Get rid of the fear of death, the fear of God, and the fear of pain, and you're really on the road to somewhere. And I find that so powerful a message, and it comes from right back there. And I try to go along with that. The fear of God, I interpret as well as fear of the state, fear of the politic, fear of the social movement. I can put that into that category as well. So it's quite a broad avenue. But anxiety is the destructor, I think. And again, reaching a point at which says, I needn't feel so anxious about this. This is not so much that I need to get worried about. As you get older, you start to think, well, I'm going to die. You read about a pop star that died 3 or 4 years younger than you, and people say about him, well, he did pretty well, didn't he? It's very disturbing. We need to conquer that in some way. And we conquer it by getting to a point at which we say, it doesn't hurt anymore. On the time thing, I don't know what your person says, as I said. But for me, time isn't real. That's not to say it's odd in a particular way, but it's not real. It's there, it just happens to be something else.
Thank you.
Awesome. So this brings us to about time to do the group exercise. So Gerald, I don't know if you want to share your screen again and with that question that you had for us, and then we can give instructions for the group breakout.
Well, or unless you've got a question you'd like to propose.
No, I think the ones you had were pretty decent. Showed me.
No, unfortunately, my thing has disappeared for some reason. And if I press that, my presentation thing has sort of disappeared off the screen. And I don't think I can get it back without stopping this.
Mm.
So I'll give you that question. It was, do you think that doing philosophy is worthwhile? If so, why? How do you reach that conclusion, whatever it is? And it would be good to hear some justification for it.
All right. So let's go in about 10 to 12-minute breakout rooms and have a conversation. If you have to slip out now, feel free to do so. I'll turn off the recording and then we'll put people in breakout rooms.